Monday, September 10, Riot in the Temple. Having accepted the church's leader's suggestion, Paul would need to undergo a 7-day ritual purification to assist the completion of the men's vow. Just like in Numbers 19, verses 11 to 13, whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. They must purify themselves with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then they will be clean. But if they do not purify themselves on the 3rd and 7th day, they will not be clean. If they fail to purify themselves after touching a human corpse, they defile the Lord's tabernacle. They must be cut off from Israel, because the water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on them. They are unclean, their uncleanness remains on them. At the same time, Jewish tradition stipulated that any person coming from Gentile lands would be unclean and so unable to enter the temple. This is why Paul had to purify himself before going to the priests to give notice of his purification process related to the Nazarenes, as it said in Acts 21:26. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. Question. Read Acts chapter 21, verses 27 to 36. What happened to Paul at the end of his 7-day period of purification? Beginning at verse 27 of Acts 21, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" A riot ensued, caused by those who stirred up the crowd against Paul, accusing him of attacking the most sacred symbols of Jewish religion, in particular of having desecrated the temple. As one of Paul's travel companions was a Gentile believer from Ephesus named Trophimus, we saw that in verse 21, they thought the apostle had introduced him into the temple's inner court, where only Jews could enter. If the accusation were legitimate, Paul would be guilty of a most serious offence. Along the wall that separated the outer from the inner court, there were signs in Greek and Latin warning Gentile visitors not to enter further in. Otherwise, they would be personally responsible for their ensuing death. Acts of the Apostles, page 407, I read, "By the Jewish law, it was a crime punishable with death for an uncircumcised person to enter the inner courts of the sacred edifice." Paul had been seen in the city in company with Trophimus, an Ephesian, and it was conjectured that he had brought him into the temple. This he had not done, and, being himself a Jew, his act in entering the temple was no violation of the law. But though the charge was wholly false, it served to arouse the popular prejudice. As the cry was taken up and borne through the temple courts, the throngs gathered there were thrown into wild excitement. End of quote. When the news of the riot reached a Roman fortress, the Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, came with troops and rescued Paul before the crowd could kill him. As we read in Acts 23:26, Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. As the target of the attacks, Paul was arrested and bound with chains while the commander tried to inquire about what was going on. At the hysteric shouting of the crowd, he ordered the apostle to be taken to the fortress. And so to finish today, rumours, false ones at that, helped start this riot. Why must we be so careful with the kinds of rumours we listen to, or even worse, spread?